Grant had never believed that betrayal would come from the people he trusted most, his wife, Lisa, and his childhood friend, Kevin. They had been close, like brothers, ever since their days in a small suburban neighborhood where every day seemed full of hope. Lisa, who he married straight after high school, was supposed to be his forever. He never imagined she'd break that promise. It was a Tuesday night when the world, as he knew it, started to crumble. He returned home from work expecting the usual routine: a kiss from Lisa, a hot meal, and the soft hum of their children playing in the next room. But something was different that evening. Lisa wasn't acting like herself. Lisa had always been a free spirit, but tonight she was unnervingly distant. Her eyes wandered, like she was avoiding something. As they sat down for dinner, she couldn't make eye contact. It was then that the text came in. "See you soon, babe. Can't wait for tonight." Grant's heart sank. He hadn't noticed the small cracks in their marriage until now. It was as though time had suddenly sped up. He looked at Lisa, her phone still in her hand. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer at first, but when he repeated the question, she just shrugged it off. "Just a friend," she said casually, but the tone in her voice was too flat. Grant didn't believe it. He'd known Lisa long enough to read between the lines. His suspicions grew. He began to put the pieces together: her sudden late-night work hours, the whispered phone calls, and now this cryptic message. His stomach churned as he walked away, retreating into the study, where he began a quiet investigation. It didn't take long. After weeks of watching and reading between the lines of texts, he caught them. Kevin had been sending Lisa late-night messages, photos, and more. What was once a friendship had turned into something much darker. The weight of the revelation crashed down on Grant like a tidal wave. He had always prided himself on his trust, on the solid foundation he'd built with Lisa. They had 3 kids, a house that they made their home, and a future that seemed secure. And yet, here he was, drowning in the painful realization that everything he thought was real had been a lie. The night of the discovery, Grant didn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, his mind replaying every little moment where he might have missed the signs. He tried to reach out to Lisa, but the distance between them had grown too wide. She was no longer the woman he married. She was a stranger, caught up in some secret world with Kevin. The next morning, as the kids left for school, Grant sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone in his hand. He had already read the text between Lisa and Kevin. There was no denying it. Lisa was in love with him. No, scratch that. Lisa was sleeping with his best friend. And there was nothing he could do to erase the image of Kevin's smiling face in those photos. His old friend, the man he had trusted with his life. It wasn't just the betrayal of love. It was the betrayal of a bond that had spanned decades. How could Kevin, his childhood friend, the person who had been there for every laugh, every tear, every victory, be the one to stab him in the back? Grant wasn't angry yet. Not at Lisa, not at Kevin. No, the anger hadn't fully set in. What was rising in him wasn't rage. It was a cold, calculated feeling. A plan was already starting to form in the back of his mind. That afternoon, after a long day of pretending everything was fine, Grant confronted Lisa. She stood in front of him, her posture defensive, like she knew what was coming. There was no remorse in her eyes, only guilt masked behind a thin veneer of pride. "Grant, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "Oh, we will," Grant replied, his tone cold and sharp. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the phone. He slapped it down onto the table, the screen lighting up with the damning messages. The pictures, the dates, everything. Lisa's face drained of color as she saw the truth laid bare in front of her. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She reached for the phone, but Grant pushed it back. "Tell me, Lisa. Tell me how long this has been going on," he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. She stumbled, her fingers trembling. A few months, Lisa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want it to happen like this. You're my best friend. Grant's eyes hardened. Best friend? You've been sleeping with my wife? That's your idea of friendship? Lisa looked down, unable to meet Grant's gaze. I didn't mean for this to happen. Lisa and I, we've been connecting, and it just happened. I swear, Grant, I never wanted to hurt you. Grant leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. Don't tell me you didn't want to hurt me. You knew exactly what you were doing, Kevin. You knew what it would do to me, and yet you still went ahead with it. There was a pause, and for the first time in their entire friendship, Grant saw Kevin as weak. His friend was broken, his self-righteousness shattered. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the next move. Grant sat back, his eyes cold. You're going to regret this. Both of you. Kevin swallowed hard, his eyes widening. What do you mean? Grant didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, dropping a stack of papers in front of Kevin. They were screenshots, texts, photos. You'll figure it out. And when you do, Grant said, walking away, I'll be waiting for you. Just remember, it's not just Lisa you'll be losing. Grant didn't waste any time. His mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the plan. He wasn't just going to confront them, he was going to make them pay for what they'd done. It wouldn't be with violence or grand gestures. No, Grant was going to use their own actions against them. He'd spent too long being the good guy, the one who bent over backward to make everyone happy. Now, it was time to take the gloves off. He started with the small stuff, the things that people take for granted but never consider the consequences of. He began by calling every mutual acquaintance, every friend from the old days, and making sure they knew the truth. One by one, he let it slip. Kevin had been having an affair with his wife. It wasn't just a passing fling, it was a full-blown betrayal, a friendship torn apart by lies. He didn't stop there. No, that was too easy. He needed to make sure they couldn't run from the consequences. It was time to hit them where it would hurt the most. Their reputations. First, he took Kevin's biggest business venture, the one he was most proud of, and made sure the world knew the truth behind it. It wasn't much, just a little digging into Kevin's financial records, a little nudge here, a little whisper there. Soon enough, the news would break about Kevin's shady dealings. The public loved a scandal, and Kevin's perfect life would come crumbling down like a house of cards. Grant knew exactly how to make sure it came to light at the most inopportune moment. Next was Lisa. She had always prided herself on being the dutiful wife, the perfect mother. She kept up appearances well, didn't she? But Grant knew the cracks that lay underneath. He dug deep, found everything he could. It wasn't hard, really. Lisa had been careless. There were emails, bank records, trips she'd taken without telling him. He had it all, and he was going to make sure it came crashing down at the right moment. Lisa had built a life of lies, and Grant was going to expose every single one of them. The day after his confrontation with Kevin, Grant sat in his living room going over the details. The shock on Kevin's face had been satisfying, but that wasn't enough. This wasn't about immediate satisfaction. This was about the long game. It was about watching them lose everything they had worked for, watching them squirm as their lives unraveled in front of them. But Grant wasn't stupid. He knew that if he wanted to truly get under their skin, he had to be more subtle. He couldn't be the angry, vengeful ex-husband and best friend. No, he had to be the guy who had it all together, the guy who walked away and didn't flinch. He had to be the one who wasn't even affected by their betrayal, who had already moved on and was building a better life without them. It was time to make his move. Grant's plan unfolded like a well-orchestrated symphony. The first strike was Kevin's business, the one that he had been boasting about for years. A small leak in the financial records, and suddenly Kevin's investors began to question the integrity of the operation. The whispers spread like wildfire. People started to wonder how Kevin had been running his business, especially with all the accusations of financial misconduct surfacing. It wasn't long before his business partners started pulling out, fearing a scandal that could tarnish their own names. Kevin called him that afternoon, his voice full of panic. "Grant, what the hell is going on? You know this isn't me. This is—" Grant interrupted him, his tone calm and measured. "Oh, it's you, Kevin. You've been living this life for far too long. It's time the world sees who you really are. You should have thought about that before you slept with my wife." Kevin's words stumbled over each other, his anger and guilt rising in equal measure. But Grant wasn't done. He wasn't in the mood to listen to Kevin beg for mercy. He'd been too good to him for too long, and now it was Kevin's turn to feel what it was like to be on the receiving end of betrayal. Grant hung up, his heart pounding. He was in control now. Kevin would have to face the consequences of his actions. But there was more work to be done. Lisa, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the weight of her own actions. Her friends had turned their backs on her, and her once spotless reputation was starting to crack. Lisa had always been the one who had everyone fooled. Her charm, her laughter, her seemingly perfect family life. But now the truth was all over town, and the cracks had turned into gaping holes. People who once looked up to her now whispered behind her back, and her social media presence, once full of smiling family photos, had become a ghost town. She tried to put on a brave face, but Grant saw through it. She wasn't crying because she was sorry for him. She was crying because she knew what was coming next. And the truth was, Grant didn't care. "Get out," he said, his voice final. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Get out. I'm done. I don't want to see you or him ever again." As she stood there shaking, Grant felt something inside him shift. It wasn't relief. It wasn't even sadness. It was a strange kind of clarity. She had made her choice. Now, he was going to make his. The days after the final confrontation were a blur of activity. Grant's life was being pulled apart and put back together in ways he never expected. While Lisa tried to salvage her dignity, Grant wasted no time. He didn't need sympathy or excuses. He needed closure, and more importantly, he needed to feel that he was back in control. It didn't take long for the consequences of his actions to fully sink in. Kevin's business was in free fall, and the stock market response was as swift as it was unforgiving. Grant's anonymous leaks about Kevin's shady financial dealings were just the beginning. The rest of the investors who had once trusted Kevin started withdrawing in droves, terrified that their association with him might ruin their own reputations. Grant watched with cold detachment as Kevin's empire crumbled. He wasn't watching for joy. No, it wasn't about victory. It was about fairness. Kevin had stabbed him in the back, and now it was his turn to feel the weight of betrayal. The phone calls between Kevin and his remaining clients turned into frantic pleas. His voice, once so confident and commanding, now carried a hint of desperation that Grant found hard to ignore. But there was no sympathy in Grant's heart for him. Kevin had chosen his path, and it led him here, alone, exposed, and ruined. Meanwhile, Lisa's own empire was beginning to erode. Her social circle, once tightly knit and supportive, began to fragment. The whispers behind her back grew louder, and people who once showered her with compliments now avoided her like the plague. Friends who had once thought of her as the epitome of grace and warmth now saw her as a liar and a cheat. Lisa was trying to keep up appearances, but the cracks were too big to hide. Grant knew that people like Lisa didn't take betrayal lightly. She might try to keep her head up and pretend everything was fine, but he could see through the facade. There was nothing left to salvage. She had burned every bridge, and now the world was watching as she fell from her high pedestal. Watching her scramble for control of a life she had ruined was strangely satisfying for Grant. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. It wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about making sure Lisa and Kevin understood the consequences of their actions. They had both treated him as a doormat, and now it was time to flip the script. Grant made sure that every friend Lisa had ever known heard the truth. He shared everything: the affair, the lies, the way she had betrayed not just him, but their entire marriage. He didn't need to scream or shout. His weapon was the quiet truth, and that was enough. It wasn't long before Lisa was forced to confront the full extent of her actions. The emails, the late-night calls, the trips, everything came to light. People she had once called friends began to distance themselves, and in the silence of her empty house, Lisa began to realize that her world had been torn apart, piece by piece. The days stretched on, each one bringing new chaos to Lisa's life. She had always prided herself on her ability to manage everything: the kids, her social life, her marriage. But now, it was all slipping away. Her friends were gone. Kevin was nowhere to be found, buried under the weight of his own failures. And Grant? He was the one person who had seen through her entire act, and he wasn't about to let her escape the consequences. Lisa's phone buzzed incessantly, each text message and phone call a reminder of what she'd lost. Her social media presence had become a ghost town, with former followers unfollowing her one by one. She had tried to make it all look like a bad dream, but the harsh reality was inescapable. Her once perfect life was crumbling to dust. Lisa reached out to Grant more than once, but each time he refused to speak to her. He couldn't bring himself to feel pity for her anymore. When they were together, he had given her everything: his trust, his love, and his devotion. And what had she given him in return? Deceit, lies, betrayal. She had chosen Kevin over him, and now it was her turn to face the fallout. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. That had been the driving force in the beginning, but now Grant felt something different, something more profound. He had moved on. It wasn't about punishing Lisa or Kevin anymore. It was about reclaiming his life. He was no longer the man he had been when this all started. He was stronger, more self-assured, and more aware of his own worth. Still, there were moments when Lisa's desperation crept into his thoughts. He had once loved her deeply. They had shared everything: the good, the bad, and the mundane. But now, when he thought of her, he felt nothing but indifference. She had made her choices, and now she was left to deal with the consequences. One afternoon, as Grant sat in his new apartment, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Kevin. "Grant, I'm sorry. I've screwed everything up. Please, can we talk? I need to make this right." Grant didn't even hesitate. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He wasn't going to let Kevin off the hook that easily. If Kevin wanted to apologize, he was going to have to earn it. But Grant wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of an easy conversation. He waited until the evening to respond, his fingers moving slowly across the keyboard as he typed. "There's nothing to fix, Kevin. You made your choice. Now deal with the consequences like a man." Grant didn't feel satisfaction when he sent the message. He felt nothing. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about closing this chapter once and for all. Kevin's apology didn't matter. What mattered was that Grant had moved on, that he was no longer bound by the chains of the past. The following days were marked by silence. No more messages, no more calls. Lisa was out of the picture, and Kevin had retreated into his failure. Grant felt free, not because he had destroyed their lives, but because he had learned to let go. His life was his own again. The weeks passed, and with each day the past began to feel like a distant memory. Kevin's business had folded completely, the damage irreversible. Lisa had retreated into herself, the facade of a perfect life shattered beyond repair. She tried to salvage what was left, her relationship with the kids, her reputation, but it was clear that things would never be the same. The world she had built from lies and deceit had crumbled, and there was no foundation left to rebuild upon. Grant didn't look back. He couldn't. The man who had been left broken and betrayed was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had learned to trust in his own resilience. He spent more time with his kids now, teaching them lessons about honor, integrity, and the importance of forgiveness, lessons he had learned the hard way. He was the father they needed, and in that role, he found purpose. His new life was simple but satisfying. He woke up each day with a sense of peace, knowing he had control over his own future. He worked harder than he ever had before, pouring himself into his career and the relationships that truly mattered. No more distractions, no more lies, no more Kevin, no more Lisa. But then, just when things seemed to be settling into a quiet rhythm, the past came knocking once again. It started with an unexpected phone call from his lawyer. Lisa had requested a meeting. Grant had a feeling she wasn't reaching out to apologize. There was something more to it, something that smelled like desperation. He agreed to the meeting, setting the time and place. When the day arrived, Grant found himself standing outside a small cafe in the heart of the city. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the street, but Grant couldn't shake the tension building in his chest. This wasn't just a conversation about their past. This was something else. Lisa arrived 10 minutes late as usual, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She looked different. The confidence that once radiated from her was gone, replaced by something much darker. Her clothes were no longer meticulously chosen, her hair no longer perfectly styled. She was tired, broken even. "Grant," she said quietly as she approached, her eyes not meeting his. He simply nodded. "Lisa, you wanted to talk?" She took a deep breath, then sat across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "I know I've messed everything up. I've ruined everything. I don't know where to begin." Grant leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "You've already begun, Lisa. You made your choice. And now you're here, asking me for something you can't get." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't speak for a moment. Instead, she wiped them away, then looked up at him with a mixture of pain and regret. "I wanted to make things right," she said, her voice shaky. "I thought that maybe I could fix this somehow, fix everything I broke." Grant's heart didn't soften. It didn't ache. It just felt empty. The woman sitting in front of him wasn't the person he had loved. She was a stranger, and all the apologies in the world couldn't change that. "Fix it?" Grant echoed, his voice low. "How? How can you fix something you've already destroyed?" Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had nothing left to say that could repair the damage she had caused. There was no magic solution, no clever phrase that could undo what had been done. Grant stood up slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm done. There's nothing left for us to fix. You made your choices, Lisa. Now you'll have to live with them." As he walked away from the cafe, Grant felt a strange sense of peace. This was the final chapter. The book was closed, and there was no going back. Grant felt the weight of the finality of his actions, but as he walked away from Lisa that afternoon, something inside him settled. The confrontation had been the last of it. He had confronted her, confronted Kevin, and exposed the truth. The past no longer held any power over him. The anger that had burned so brightly when he first learned about the affair had faded, leaving nothing but a cold, unfeeling resolve. The weeks that followed felt like a new beginning. Grant focused on his work, spending more time on projects he had neglected during the chaos. He poured energy into his relationship with his kids, making sure they knew how much they meant to him. Every day felt like a small victory, and he began to realize that he had reclaimed his life. He wasn't defined by Lisa or Kevin anymore. He had always been the kind of man to hold on to grudges, to let resentment seep into his bones. But now, he felt lighter. There was no need to hold on to that anger anymore. He had done what needed to be done, and now he was free to live his life the way he wanted. But just as he was getting comfortable in his new life, a familiar name popped up on his phone screen. It was Kevin. The message was simple. "Grant, we need to talk. I don't have anywhere else to go. Can we meet?" Grant stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the keyboard. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend like he hadn't seen the message. Kevin had already ruined everything, already caused enough damage. But a small part of him, the part that still remembered their friendship, wondered if maybe, just maybe, Kevin had learned something. Maybe he had finally realized the depth of what he had done. He agreed to meet Kevin at a small bar, the one where they used to hang out years ago before everything had started to fall apart. It was quiet, a little rundown, but familiar in a way that made Grant feel a pang of nostalgia for the friendship that had once meant so much. Kevin arrived early, his face drawn and tired. The confident man Grant had known was gone, replaced by someone who seemed smaller, defeated. When he saw Grant walk through the door, his face softened, and he stood to greet him. There was no bravado, no cocky smile, just exhaustion. "Grant," Kevin said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know where to start. I've messed up. I lost everything. My business, my family, my dignity." Grant took a seat, his eyes steady but unyielding. "You did. You threw it all away for something that wasn't even real." Kevin dropped his gaze. "I know. I've been living in a hole for weeks, trying to figure out how to get back up. But every time I try, it feels like I'm just sinking deeper. I lost Lisa. I lost everything. I just wanted to fix it. Fix everything." Grant exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "You can't fix it, Kevin. What you did can't be undone. You destroyed our friendship. You destroyed your business. And most of all, you destroyed Lisa's trust. You don't get to fix it just because you feel bad now." Kevin looked at him, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I need to know that at some point you'll be able to move on. I need to know that you're not carrying this around forever." Grant stared at him for a long moment. Part of him wanted to lash out, to scream at Kevin for everything he had done. But another part of him, one that was starting to feel a sense of closure, realized that Kevin's apology, though long overdue, was enough. "You've apologized, Kevin, but forgiveness isn't something I can give you. That's something you need to earn, starting with yourself." Kevin sat back, his shoulders slumping. "I'll never be able to make it right, will I?" Grant stood up, his decision made. "No, you won't. But maybe, just maybe, you'll find a way to live with what you've done. And that's the only peace you're going to get." Grant walked out of the bar without another word. The closure he'd been seeking had finally arrived, not in the form of an apology but in the realization that he had let go. There was nothing left to fix. He had moved on. And now, so had Kevin. The weeks after his meeting with Kevin passed quietly, and Grant had never felt more certain of the path he had chosen. His life was his own again. The tension that had clouded his mind for months had lifted, replaced by a sense of peace that came with knowing the truth had been exposed. There was no more pretending, no more wondering what could have been. It was time to move forward. The divorce was finalized, and Grant was awarded full custody of the kids. Lisa had fought hard for them, but in the end, she had nothing left to offer. She was a shell of the woman she had once been, trying to rebuild a life from the ashes of her own mistakes. She had moved into a small apartment far from the comfortable home she once enjoyed. Grant had no sympathy left to give her. He had spent too many years trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. Grant focused on his children, making sure they knew that despite everything that had happened, they were still loved and wanted. He put in the time. He attended their school events, helped with homework, and spent weekends taking them to the park. The love and attention he gave them were his new priorities, and he felt the bonds between them growing stronger every day. He wasn't entirely alone in this new chapter. As the months passed, he found himself reconnecting with old friends, people who had known him before Lisa, before the betrayal. They had been there for him in the background, but now they were a more prominent part of his life. There was no more shame, no more hiding behind closed doors. His life was unfolding, and the people who had stuck by him were finally getting a glimpse of the man he was becoming. His work was thriving as well. Grant had been overlooked for years, his potential stifled by the chaos of his personal life. But now, with everything settled, he poured himself into his career. Promotions came swiftly, his colleagues noticing the quiet determination he exuded. Success came not just from hard work, but from the clarity of mind he had gained from walking away from the toxic relationship he'd once been in. And then, one evening, as Grant sat in his small apartment with a glass of wine, he realized that he had finally found peace. It wasn't the peace he had thought he would find years ago, in the comfort of his marriage or in the ideal life he had built with Lisa. It wasn't the world he had imagined for himself, but it was a world where he had control. He no longer relied on anyone else for his happiness. He had earned it himself. The kids were with Lisa that weekend, and as he settled into the quiet, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought him here. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the pain. He thought of the man he had been when it all began. A man desperate to hold on to something that had long since slipped away. But now he was different, stronger, wiser, and he was finally living a life that was his own. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he would ever find love again. But at that moment, it didn't matter. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that true peace came not from others, but from within. And for the first time in years, Grant felt whole. As time moved forward, Grant settled into his new life with a sense of stability he hadn't known in years. The chaos of the past had been replaced by an unexpectedly serene routine. There was no longer a lingering tension, no weight pressing down on him. He was free. He spent his days focused on his work, his evenings with the kids, and weekends slowly rebuilding the parts of his life he had neglected. And though there were days when loneliness crept in, when he missed the family he thought he would have forever, there were also days filled with small victories. His relationship with the kids had never been stronger. They were thriving in a way that filled him with pride. The memories of their former home, the laughter, the joy, began to fade, replaced by the new memories they were making together. Every moment felt like a step further away from the past. Grant knew he was doing the right thing, but even as he embraced his new life, the past still lingered. Lisa hadn't given up completely. She still tried to maintain contact, sending texts and occasionally calling, hoping for some kind of reconciliation. She always sounded apologetic, remorseful, but Grant had nothing left to say to her. He had given her everything once. Now, there was nothing. One evening, as he sat in his apartment scrolling through old photos of the kids, he received a message. It was from Lisa. "I need to talk to you, please, just once more, for the kids." Grant sat there, his finger hovering over the screen. It had been months since they had exchanged any real words, and the idea of meeting her again stirred something in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that their chapter had closed. But a tiny part of him still felt something. Whether it was nostalgia or curiosity, he wasn't sure. He agreed to meet her, though the decision didn't come easily. He wasn't sure what she wanted to say, or why she wanted to say it now. But maybe, just maybe, this would give them both the closure they needed. The cafe they met at was quiet, tucked in a corner of the city that felt both familiar and foreign. Lisa was already there when Grant arrived, sitting at a table near the window, her eyes vacant, lost. She didn't look like the woman who had once been so confident, so sure of herself. Now, she looked like a woman who had been broken by her own choices. "Grant," she said, her voice soft and tentative. "I know I've made mistakes. I've hurt you in ways I can never fix. I don't know how to live with the guilt anymore. I thought I could keep going, but I can't." Grant sat down across from her, his expression neutral. "What do you want, Lisa? What's left to say?" She hesitated, searching his eyes as if looking for something, some trace of the man she had known. "I just need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. I was selfish. I made choices I can't undo. I thought it was too late to fix things. But I've realized that I have to face the consequences. I've lost everything. And now, I just don't know what to do." Grant listened, but he didn't feel anything. The apology she offered was a hollow echo of the one he had waited for years to hear. But it was too little. Too late. There was nothing she could offer him now that would change what had happened. "I think you're right," Grant said finally, his voice calm. "You can't undo what's been done. You can't fix it. And that's something you'll have to live with." Lisa's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment, he saw the woman she had once been, the woman he had loved, the woman who had promised him a future. But that woman was gone now. She had chosen Kevin over him, and there was no going back. Grant stood up, placing a hand on the table. "I've moved on, Lisa. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not bitter. But I don't need this. I don't need you in my life." For the first time in their conversation, Lisa's tears began to fall. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry," she whispered. Grant nodded, his heart firm. "I know. And I'm sorry too. But it's over." He turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Lisa behind. He didn't look back. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to go back to. The days that followed the meeting with Lisa felt different. Not in an overwhelming way, but in a subtle shift. A weight lifting off Grant's shoulders that he hadn't fully realized was there. There was something final about their conversation, something that marked the true end of an era. It wasn't just the closure he had been hoping for. It was the realization that he no longer needed any validation from Lisa or anyone else. Grant's life was his own now, built on the lessons he had learned the hard way. He wasn't bitter or angry anymore. The resentment that had once consumed him had been replaced with something far more valuable: peace. He had found a balance between his work and his time with the kids. His job was thriving, but more importantly, he had begun to reconnect with himself, something he hadn't done in years. His friendships were stronger, and he had built new ones with people who knew him for who he was now, not who he had been. He didn't need to hide behind the masks of a broken marriage anymore. He was Grant, and he was finally free. One quiet evening, after tucking the kids into bed, Grant found himself standing in front of the mirror in his bathroom. He hadn't looked at himself like this in a long time, really looked at himself. The man staring back at him was different from the man who had once been broken by betrayal. There were laugh lines around his eyes, a testament to the joy he had found in the small moments. The weight of the past still lingered in the form of scars, but they were no longer painful. They were just part of his story, reminders of what he had overcome. He ran a hand through his hair, looking into his own eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. It wasn't a sad smile, or one filled with the bitterness of the past. It was a smile of quiet acceptance, of knowing that he had come out the other side stronger. The next day, Grant received a call that changed everything. It wasn't from Lisa, or Kevin, or anyone else from the past. It was from a friend he hadn't spoken to in years, a childhood friend who had reached out to him after hearing about the changes in his life. The friend was in town for a brief visit, and they had made plans to catch up. As they sat down for a coffee at a local cafe, the conversation flowed easily. It felt natural, like no time had passed. Grant found himself laughing for the first time in what felt like forever, talking about his life now, his career, the kids. His friend had heard about the divorce and the aftermath, but it was clear that the man across from him saw only the strength in Grant. "You've done it," his friend said, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You've really come through. I didn't think you could, but I'm proud of you." Grant shrugged, though the compliment hit him harder than he expected. "I didn't have a choice. It was either sink or swim. I chose to swim." And swim he had. He had not only survived the storm, he had come out of it with a newfound clarity, a renewed sense of self. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was his. That night, as Grant sat in his small apartment, the kids asleep in the next room, he realized that he had finally let go of everything that had once held him back. The past no longer had a hold on him. He was no longer defined by the betrayal or the pain. He was defined by his resilience, his ability to rise from the ashes and build something better from the brokenness. The phone buzzed on the counter, a reminder that life would continue, that there would always be challenges ahead. But Grant wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready for whatever came next. He had finally built the life he deserved. Grant hadn't expected anything to change so quickly. After all, life had a way of throwing curveballs at the most inconvenient times. But he was finally feeling settled, his world steady for the first time in years. His relationship with his kids was strong, his career flourishing, and for the first time, he wasn't burdened by the weight of his past. And then, out of nowhere, she reappeared. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a few months after his last encounter with Lisa. Grant had just wrapped up a long day at work and was looking forward to some quiet time with his kids. The phone call came while he was making dinner, a call he hadn't expected, and one that caused his stomach to tighten with anxiety when he saw the caller ID Lisa. He hesitated, then picked up the phone. "Hello? Grant, it's Lisa. I know it's been a while, but I need to talk to you about something important," she said, her voice sounding different than it had before, calmer, more composed. Grant was quiet for a moment, weighing his options. He could ignore her, he could hang up, but something in her tone stopped him. He had heard all her apologies before, but there was something in the way she spoke now that made him curious. Was this just another plea for forgiveness, or was it something else entirely? "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lisa sighed on the other end of the line. "It's not about us, Grant, it's about the kids." Grant's heart skipped a beat. His mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario, his thoughts racing to all the things that could go wrong. Had something happened to the kids? Was there some issue at school? He didn't have time for games or drama, not when his kids were involved. "What's wrong with the kids?" he asked, a sharp edge to his voice. No, nothing's wrong, it's just, I've been thinking a lot lately. I know I haven't been the best mother and I need to make some changes," Lisa said, her voice softer now. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, and I'm not asking you to fix things. I just want to talk about how we can make this work for them. They deserve more than what I've given them." Grant paused, surprised by the sincerity in her words. Lisa had always been the one to focus on appearances, on keeping up the perfect image. The idea that she was now calling him, not for her own sake but for the kids, caught him off guard. This wasn't the Lisa he knew, the woman who had been so focused on her own needs, her own desires, that she had forgotten about everything else. "What do you need from me?" Grant asked, his voice quieter now, the sharpness gone. "I just want to make sure we're on the same page. For the kids, Grant. I want them to have stability, and I know that starts with us. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to do better." Lisa replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I'm trying to make things right, even if it's too late for us." Grant looked out the window, the setting sun casting a warm glow on the city below. He wasn't sure what this meant or what Lisa really wanted, but in that moment, he realized that he wasn't angry anymore. He had spent so long focused on what had been taken from him that he had forgotten how important it was to forgive, not for the sake of the other person, but for his own peace of mind. "Okay," Grant said, taking a deep breath. "We'll talk. For them. But this is the last time I'm doing this, Lisa. I've moved on and I'm not going back." He ended the call with a feeling he hadn't expected. Relief. Not for Lisa, not for the past, but for himself. This was the last thread connecting him to the woman who had once been the center of his world. Now, he was free. Truly free. And that freedom was something he would never give up. It was strange, the way time worked. In the beginning, when the pain from Lisa's betrayal had felt fresh and raw, Grant had never imagined reaching this point, this place where peace and contentment existed. He had been so consumed with his anger, with the feeling of being wronged, that he hadn't realized how much of his energy had been spent fighting a battle that was already over. But now, everything had changed. The anger was gone, replaced by an understanding that there was no need to hold on to the past any longer. And for the first time in years, Grant was no longer focused on what had been taken from him. He was focused on the present and, most importantly, the future. Meeting Lisa that day in the cafe hadn't been as dramatic as he had expected. In fact, it had been almost anticlimactic. She hadn't begged for reconciliation or tried to convince him of her sincerity. She had come with the sole purpose of talking about their children, and though it wasn't the conversation he had thought would bring closure, it did. Lisa, for all her flaws, was trying, and that effort, no matter how late, gave Grant a sense of peace. The next few weeks were about rebuilding, not the past, but the future. He worked hard at keeping things stable for the kids, focusing on providing them with everything they needed emotionally. Grant's role as a father had always been something he took pride in, but now it was more than just a duty, it was his purpose. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a job he had to do out of obligation. He wanted to be the best father he could be. He wanted his children to feel loved and valued in a way that he had not been able to give them during the years of his marriage. As for his relationship with Lisa, it remained cordial but distant. She wasn't a part of his life the way she had been before, and he didn't want her to be. But they were parents together, and they both knew that meant working together in the best interest of their children. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable, but it was necessary. One Saturday, while the kids were at a friend's house, Grant decided to take a walk. He found himself wandering aimlessly through the park, his mind quiet for once, not consumed by the thoughts of betrayal, but by the simple act of living. As he walked past the benches and the trees, he noticed a couple sitting together, laughing and talking. For a brief moment his heart ached, but it wasn't from jealousy. It was from a longing he didn't fully understand. Something deep inside him that wanted companionship again. It had been a long time since he had allowed himself to think about love. He had spent so much time rebuilding his life that the idea of sharing it with someone new seemed like a distant dream. But as he sat on a bench, watching the sunset, he realized that maybe it wasn't so impossible. Maybe there was someone out there who would appreciate the man he had become. Not the one who had been broken and betrayed, but the one who had rebuilt himself from scratch. Grant didn't know if he was ready for love, but the thought was there now. It wasn't an overwhelming urge, but a quiet possibility. He was open to it. For the first time, he was open to the idea of letting someone into his life again, not as a way to fill a void, but because he had grown into a man who was complete on his own. For now, though, he wasn't rushing. He had all the time in the world to figure it out. Grant had settled into a routine, and though life was far from perfect, it was his. It was a life he had rebuilt, piece by piece after the storm that had torn through it. The kids were flourishing, his career was stable, and the relationships he had nurtured were strong. But there was still one thing that he hadn't been able to shake: the lingering uncertainty of what the future held. It was a Friday evening when Grant's phone buzzed. He had just finished a long day at work and was looking forward to a quiet weekend with the kids. The message came from Carter, his old college friend. Carter had been there for him when he needed someone to talk to after everything fell apart, and their bond had remained strong, even after all the chaos with Lisa and Kevin. "Grant, you free this weekend? I've got something I think you need to hear." Grant furrowed his brow, unsure of what Carter meant. He hadn't expected anything urgent, but Carter had always been a bit of a wild card. After a few seconds, he tapped back. "What's up?" "Let's meet up. Trust me, you'll want to hear this." Curiosity piqued. Grant agreed to meet him at their usual spot, a quiet bar they'd frequented back in their college days. It was one of those places that had stood the test of time, just like their friendship. When Grant arrived, Carter was already sitting at the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand. His face, though tired, was filled with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," Carter said with a grin as he motioned for Grant to sit. "I've got something for you, something that's going to change everything." Grant raised an eyebrow, the skepticism creeping into his voice. "What are you talking about?" Lisa, Carter said, taking a slow sip of his drink, watching Grant's reaction closely. She's been talking to me. Not about you, about herself. I think it's time for you to know the real reason why everything happened. Grant felt the stirrings of anger rise up in him, but he kept his composure. I don't need to hear anything more from Lisa, Carter. She's the last person I want to talk to. Carter held up a hand, urging him to listen. I get that, believe me. But what I've got here, this is something you need to hear. Something that could explain a lot of the things that didn't make sense at the time. Grant sat back, arms crossed, and listened. Carter leaned in, lowering his voice. You know how Lisa always seemed like she had everything under control, right? Like she always had a plan? Well, it turns out she didn't. She had a secret. A big one. Something that was eating her up inside. Grant was quiet, his mind processing the information. The last thing he wanted to do was revisit the past, but there was something in Carter's voice that made him pause. Something told him this wasn't just another attempt to stir up old wounds. Go on, Grant said, his voice softer now, curiosity beginning to take over. I did some digging after you told me about the divorce, Carter continued, and I found out that Lisa had been seeing someone else long before she got involved with Kevin. It wasn't just an affair, it was a full-blown emotional relationship. She was trying to keep it secret, but the more I dug, the more I found. Grant felt the blood rush to his face. What? Who? That's the thing, Carter said, leaning closer. She wasn't just cheating with Kevin. There was another man. Someone she's been involved with for years. It goes deeper than just the betrayal you saw. This was about Lisa trying to hold on to control over everything. Her family, her image, her life. And she couldn't. Grant sat in stunned silence. He had always known there was more to the story than he had been told. But this was something entirely different. Why didn't you tell me earlier? I didn't know how to bring it up. I didn't want to add more pain to what you were already going through. But now that you've got the truth about Kevin, I think you deserve to know the whole story. Grant took a deep breath, his emotions swirling. The anger, the hurt, and the confusion were all there, but they were different now. This wasn't just about a betrayal. This was about the unraveling of a life, his marriage, and everything he had once believed was true. Do you think it's too late to fix it? Carter asked quietly. Grant looked at his old friend and smiled, though it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was a smile of acceptance. No, Carter, it's never about fixing it, it's about moving on. I've already moved on. The revelation about Lisa's hidden affair with another man rocked Grant in ways he hadn't anticipated. The betrayal went beyond anything he could have imagined. He thought the worst had already happened when he discovered the affair with Kevin. But this was an entire new level of deception. He sat in silence for a long moment, letting the weight of it all sink in. Carter's words echoed in his mind. Lisa had spent years hiding this from him, manipulating everything around her to maintain control. It wasn't just that she had chosen someone else over him. It was the depth of the lie, the years spent deceiving him in ways he had never even considered. Grant could feel the anger bubbling up, but this time, it wasn't directed at Lisa or Kevin. It was directed at the version of himself he had once been, the man who had believed in love, in marriage, in loyalty. The man who had given everything to a woman who had never truly respected him. But now, that man was gone. He had learned the hard way that respect and trust were the foundation of everything, and now that he understood that, he would never settle for anything less again. So what do you do with this information? Grant asked Carter, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of everything he had just learned. I don't know, man, Carter replied. It's your call. You've got the truth now. You can either keep it to yourself or confront her. But I'll tell you one thing, Grant. She's not the woman you thought she was. Grant looked down at his drink, swirling the amber liquid in the glass. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to feel. Anger, certainly. Pain, yes. But more than anything, There was a sense of clarity. Lisa's secrets, the years of deception, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was what he chose to do with it all. "I don't think I need to confront her," Grant said, setting the glass down with a soft clink. "I already know everything I need to know." Carter looked at him, a mixture of understanding and concern on his face. "So, what's next?" Grant smiled, though it wasn't out of joy. It was out of acceptance. "What's next is me, finally putting this behind me. I've already moved on from her. From all of it. It doesn't matter anymore." For the first time in a long time, Grant felt at peace. There was no need to chase after the past, no need to get answers from someone who had already taken everything from him. The truth was enough. The truth was what had set him free. The next few days were quiet, and Grant didn't feel the need to reach out to Lisa. He didn't need to confront her with the knowledge he had gained. He knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. The silence between them felt like a final goodbye, a farewell to a life that had never truly been his to begin with. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Grant sat on the couch with a notebook in front of him. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he needed to write it down. He needed to give voice to everything he had been holding inside for so long. As he wrote, the words came easily. It wasn't a letter to Lisa or Kevin. It wasn't about anyone else, it was about him. About what he had learned through this entire process. The pain, the betrayal, the lessons. And how, despite everything, he had come out stronger. When he finished, he looked at the page. It wasn't a grand statement, it wasn't a manifesto, but it was his truth. And that truth was enough. Grant closed the notebook and set it aside, a sense of finality settling over him. He didn't need to keep reliving the past. The truth had been written down, and he was ready to move forward. Tomorrow was a new day, a day filled with possibilities, a day where he would continue building the life he deserved. Grant sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was silent, save for the faint sound of traffic outside. The weight of the past few years had finally lifted, and for the first time in a long time he felt as though he could breathe. He had been through hell and back, but now he was standing on the other side of it, stronger than before. It had taken a long time to get to this point. There were days when he thought he wouldn't make it, when the pain of betrayal and heartbreak seemed too much to bear. But somehow, piece by piece, he had put his life back together. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quick, but he had done it. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from his sister, Jennifer. "Hey, how about a family dinner this weekend? The kids would love to see you." Grant smiled to himself as he typed a quick reply. "Sounds great. I'll bring the kids." It was moments like these that reminded him just how far he had come. He was surrounded by people who cared about him, his friends, his family, and most importantly, his children. They were the ones who had kept him going when everything seemed to be falling apart. And now, they were the ones who made his life feel complete. Grant had learned a lot over the past few years, but the biggest lesson had been about resilience. He had learned how to pick himself up when he was knocked down, how to keep moving forward even when it felt like there was no way out. It was easy to lose sight of who you were in the midst of betrayal, to let the actions of others define you. But Grant had refused to let that happen. He had refused to let anyone take his sense of self. He had finally stopped looking for validation from others, especially from Lisa and Kevin. It wasn't about proving them wrong or seeking their approval anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could rise above the pain, that he could build a life that was his own. And he had done it. Grant stood up from the bed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The kids would be home soon, and he had a few hours to prepare for their visit to Jennifer's. He wasn't sure what the future would bring, but for the first time he felt ready for whatever came next. There were no more ghosts from the past haunting him. No more regrets. Just the present, and the possibility of a future that he could create for himself. He looked at the photos on the wall, pictures of the kids, of moments they had shared together. of the life he was building. His heart swelled with pride. He had come through this stronger than he had ever thought possible, and now he was free. Free to live his life on his own terms, free to chase his own happiness, free to be the man he had always wanted to be. Grant grabbed his keys and headed for the door, his heart lighter than it had ever been. The world was full of opportunities, and he was finally ready to embrace them.